I'm John Sullivan, U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation. 80 years ago today, on October 23, 1941, the United States Senate passed a $5.98 billion supplemental Lend-Lease bill, bringing the United States one step closer to direct involvement in World War II. This was the second piece of Lend-Lease legislation that empowered President Roosevelt to sell, transfer, lend, or lease war supplies, such as equipment, food, and weapons, to American allies during World War II. President Roosevelt responded to the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union by immediately offering assistance. By October 1941, the first Lend-Lease equipment to the Soviet Union was already on its way. In addition to weaponry, which the Soviet Army used with great success throughout the war, non-military equipment allowed Soviet industry to free up capacity to boost the output in other areas related to the war effort. Lend-Lease was also about moral support. The Soviet people knew that they were not fighting on their own, but supported by the community of nations united by their opposition to fascism. Lend-Lease also brought together ordinary Russians and Americans supporting the war effort. It bridged the gap between the two nations that were divided by ideology. Memoirs by Soviets and Americans who brought Lend-Lease equipment to Russia via the polar convoy route document how they shared unimaginable hardships throughout the war. The U.S.-Soviet alliance during World War II was essential to securing the defeat of Nazi Germany. Although relations between the Soviet Union and the United States had been strained in the run-up to World War II, our two countries joined efforts to fight the common enemy that threatened the very survival of both of our countries. The defeat of Nazi Germany could not have been accomplished without close cooperation and shared sacrifices. As a result, I'm excited to introduce a short documentary about the Lend-Lease program, which highlights an important chapter in the shared history of our two countries. We hope you enjoy the program.
The Soviet victory in World War II was hard-fought and well-deserved. But in his memoirs, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who had served as a military commissar under Joseph Stalin during the war, revealed that Stalin told him, "If the United States had not helped us, we would have not won the war." What Stalin was talking about was a U.S. program known as Lend-Lease. Through the Lend-Lease program, the U.S. supplied the USSR and other allies with food, fuel, and weaponry from 1941 to 1945. In return, the U.S. received leases on naval and army bases in Allied territory during World War II. Russian historian Boris Vadimovich Sokolov wrote that without Western shipments under Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union would not have been able to win the Great Patriotic War, since it could not itself produce sufficient quantities of arms and military equipment or adequate supplies of fuel and ammunition. The Lend-Lease program was the key to the Russian and Allied victory in World War II. The creation of Lend-Lease marked the end to a long period of American neutrality. The 1930s was a time of economic depression, and the U.S. had not yet paid off its debts for its costly involvement in World War I. While citizens struggled to stay afloat during the hard times, they noticed that bankers and arms manufacturers had made enormous profits from the war. A congressional committee was formed in 1934 to investigate these profits, chaired by U.S. Senator Gerald Nye. The Nye Committee's findings suggested to many Americans that the U.S. had entered the war for profit, not the high moral purposes that had been suggested by the pro-war propaganda of the time. As a result of the findings of the Nye Committee, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts during the 1930s. These laws made it illegal for any American to sell or transport arms to any other nation currently at war. But after Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt began to worry about the military aggression of the Axis powers. Roosevelt convinced Congress to add a cash and carry provision to the Neutrality Act of 1939. Cash and carry allowed nations at war to purchase arms from the U.S., provided they pay for them immediately, in cash, and assumed all risk in transporting the arms themselves. This provision allowed the U.S. to aid the Allied nations battling Germany while maintaining a semblance of neutrality. Britain purchased arms for its fight against Germany through the Cash and Carry program. But after the fall of France and the evacuation at Dunkirk, England found its monetary reserves almost completely depleted. Prime Minister Winston Churchill wrote a letter to Roosevelt on December 7, 1940, asking for help. And in order to fulfill Churchill's request, Roosevelt came up with the idea of the Lend-Lease Program. Lend-Lease essentially exploited a loophole in existing laws, since it didn't involve direct payment for material, but rather a swap of material for base leases. It was permissible under the existing neutrality acts. Roosevelt declared,
"We must be the great arsenal of democracy."
And on March 11, 1941, he signed the Lend-Lease Bill into law. Roosevelt knew that Russian victory over Germany was essential to the Allied war effort. If Germany defeated the Soviet Union, the most important front in Europe would be lost. So he used Lend-Lease to help the USSR achieve victory in any way possible. Through the Lend-Lease program, the U.S. gave the Soviet Union $11 billion worth of food, clothing, and raw materials, the equivalent of $161 billion today. The German invasion of Russia had deprived the USSR of a huge swath of its agricultural base. As a result of the war, the amount of working farmland in the country dropped by 40%. Tens of millions of farm animals and tens of thousands of agricultural machines had been captured by the enemy, and 19 million agricultural workers had to leave their farms in order to join the military effort. All of these problems were alleviated by the massive supplies of food and food production equipment given through Lend-Lease. Without the program, the Soviet economy would have been on the brink of collapse. In return, the Soviet Union supplied the U.S. with materials that were badly needed for the American war effort, including platinum, gold, chrome, manganese, and wood. Ultimately, the amount of reverse Lend-Lease given to the U.S. by the USSR amounted to $2 million, or $29 million today. The delivery of this enormous influx of material was made over 3 routes. Half of all the Lend-Lease deliveries went to Russia via the Pacific, but because of the war between the U.S. and Japan, only Russian ships could be used, and only non-military goods could be transported. An Arctic convoy was the shortest and most direct route, but also the most dangerous, as it involved sailing past German-occupied Norway. The Persian Corridor was the longest route, but not fully operational until 1942. World War II was the first war in which armies were made entirely mobile through the use of motorized vehicles. Without Lend-Lease trains and trucks, every Russian offensive would have stalled at an earlier stage, lacking the motorized vehicles needed to maintain a modern military campaign. 93% of wartime railroad production in the USSR was provided by the Lend-Lease program. During the Depression, the Soviet government had hired foreign industrial giants to construct modern railway factories. But with the onset of war, these factories had switched from civilian to military production, and locomotive production came to a standstill. The Soviet Union was highly reliant on rail transportation, and during the course of the war, Lend-Lease provided the USSR with 2,000 locomotives and 11,000 rail cars. Lend-Lease also supplied the Soviet military with thousands of U.S.-made trucks. By 1945, nearly a third of all trucks in the Red Army were U.S.-built, and in 1942, the U.S. shipped an entire factory from the Ford Motor Company's River Rouge plant in Michigan to Russia in order to produce 1 million tires a year in the Soviet Union. Lend-Lease also provided the USSR with 18,000 aircraft, 7,000 tanks, as well as significant amounts of arms and ammunition. The contribution of these weapons and resources was an essential part of Russia's victory in the war. And Russia's victory, by keeping open the European front, was an essential part of the Allies' ultimate defeat of the Nazis. The cooperation and mutual support between the U.S. and Russia, fostered through the Lend-Lease Program, created Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy, a foundation on which the United Allies could build their ultimate path to victory together.